Hello, my name is Roger Green, and this is a course on Native American history. There will be several lectures, and my audience is both students at the university level and people who are subscribers to my ongoing community engagement endeavor, the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. But some of you may be taking a course for credit and have reading assignments and writing assignments in addition, and some of you might just be watching these lectures uh, just for ongoing self-education, right? And so I'm going to share my screen here and jump right in. This is an introductory lecture, and so I'm not going to do a whole bunch of jumping back into history. I'm just doing some framing here for lecture number one. So I've titled this lecture History and Memory, Worldview and What We Bring to Our Study. What's important about this intro lecture is that I want us to be thinking about what is the concept of history itself. For those of you on campus or at the university, you are history majors, or I expect that almost all of you are from different, at various different places in the program for sure. And what is history as a concept versus something like memory is something that we could think about. And then this notion of worldview, which is going to be new to most folks. It is particular to my own scholarship and research and my work with Native American folks, in particular, an elder named Tink Tinker, who's Washaje or Osage Nation. He is a mentor of mine, former professor of mine, and we have co-written a text together about worldview. So there's some terminology to get out to begin with here. And I want you to just, from the beginning, just note that when I say worldview, what I'm not saying is something like perspective, like you have a different perspective than me, or your culture is different than mine, something like this. We mean something much deeper when we're talking about an indigenous or a Native American, more specific than indigenous, because we could talk about connections between indigenous cultures sort of globally and the ways that they've faced the conditions of colonialism, which are much broader than the North American continent, which will be the main focus of this course. Although when I say Native American, I mean the Southern continent as well. So yeah, indigenous peoples around the world have faced this phenomenon of colonization, the growth of extractive capitalism over the past 500 years for sure. Uh, More specifically, we'll be dealing with Native American history here as well. And I'll have to say some things about that term, even the term Native American or the term Indian, which we will address here in the first lecture. But from the beginning, we're thinking about worldview as something really close to cognitive formation in the early 5 years of a child's life. That we know from current cognitive science, and in addition to the indigenous or specifically American Indian perspectives that I'm going to be addressing in the class. We know that the ways that we see um, the world, the reality, as it said, our metaphysical sort of conception of what reality is formulated largely in those first 5 years of life. It's very closely connected to language. And so language gives us a way in to seeing aspects of worldview, although it has to do with embodiment and gesture and the cultures that we are born into and the intergenerational aspects that inform how we have come to be where we are right now. So I will use the term following Tink Tinker, my colleague and friend, We use the term Euro-Christian basically as a replacement for the ways that people generally in the United States refer to white people. Um, just to be very clear, I would identify as well as being Euro-Christian, has nothing to do with my religious beliefs. We're using it, generally speaking, all lowercase, all one word, to talk about a social movement and a worldview that informs the ways that uh, European and Christian people um, had at the outset of their first contact with Native Americans, and that persists throughout various different historical changes in how we think about something like a separation between church and state and things like that, right? The early formations, as we will look at in this class, and I will point to specific documents and historical cases, the early separation or divisions that European invaders made was first between Christian and non-Christian. They justified their domination because it doesn't matter if you're Portuguese, which is a different culture than Spanish, different culture than Italian, different culture than French, different culture than English or Dutch, right? Those are all different cultures, different languages. All of the Europeans at the outset agreed among themselves as Christians that they would have dealings that would be somewhat uh, early formations of international, what we would now call international law. They would deal with each other's in one particular way and to their claims to the lands because they shared a Christian faith beneath them. Whereas all of the non-natives were non-Christians. It was their lack of Christianity that led the European Christians to believe that they could enact dominance over the lands that we will largely be talking about in this class, right? So when I'm talking about worldview here, I'm not talking about like capital C Christianity. If you're a churchgoer or something, your church may or may not have been dealing with doctrine of discovery stuff, but lots of churches today do, lots of Christian churches do. And you might think of yourself as anti-religious or an atheist, for example, but think about it cognitively speaking. If you're an atheist, like rejecting God, right? That's literally what the word means, a, and then the theo part of theist is God. You have to have a concept of God first, from which you distinguish your identity to say, I don't believe in that, right? So atheists are still Euro-Christians. It has nothing to do with your avowal of a personal faith or something like that when we're talking about worldview here. So I will say a lot more about worldview throughout the class, but just as we get going into this lecture, I just wanted to start there. That worldview is just get rid of the idea that worldview is something like a perspective that you have, or even an ideology that you can shift. Like, oh, now I've learned so much about native stuff. I can like, there's no adopting for a hero Christian adopting American Indian worldview. It doesn't mean that we can't learn from each other, but we need to have the humility and a sense of kind of boundaries and the limits of those boundaries, especially because Euro-Christian domination remains a colonizing presence for all Native American peoples across both continents today. Okay, so I'm going to jump into my writing here, which I have written out for um, uh, the purposes of clarity, and so that I can share with students who need to access my language in a different form here. So I'm going to stick to my script. From the outset, I need to acknowledge that the very notion of history is a concept loaded with Euro-Christian baggage. Much of what we do in a university course is always already framed within a Euro-Christian worldview. And it's necessary when addressing any topic related to Indigenous peoples to account for a through line of indigenous criticism of the Euro-Christian invader worldview with its various different cultural expressions. So, for example, Anglo-Protestant, French, Spanish, Catholic, Anglican, Puritan, Anabaptist, capitalist, communist, etc. Political categories, religious categories, cultural categories, linguistic categories, right? No matter those Euro-Christian invader cultures and their cultural expressions, there is a through line from that we can see historically, limited as it is, and distorted as it is, because a lot of times when we're encountering American Indian worldview, like or we're accounting it, we're reading it through accounts of that are written by colonizers, which are inevitably biased, right? So simultaneously, in addition to be paying attention to this through line of indigenous criticism of Euro-Christian invaders, whenever possible, I need to draw attention to through lines of indigenous memory that have been critical of the Euro-Christian worldview and its ongoing effects. So here's these two concepts, memory and history, right? And I'm going to say that the history itself as a concept, as a major, if you're majoring in it at a university, is always already a Euro-Christian concept. If we're using those concepts and asking indigenous peoples to fit into those conceptions, then they have to distort their own worldview in order to participate in dialogue, right? And just because they're participating in the dialogue, um, it doesn't mean that everything is a one for one transfer in terms of communication, right? A lot of times, there will be two different uses of language of the same terms, for example. And so Euro-Christian culture tends towards abstractions or abstract nominals, as my friend Tink Tinker often points out, like history. It's a philosophical concept. We could debate it, right? Like the good or justice. If it's a matter of chairs in the room and we're in the same room together, we can count and figure it out together, right? But philosophical concepts, the concepts that organize our knowledge and our thinking, are abstract concepts, and Euro-Christian culture loves to use them, right? So those concepts are expressive of something deeper than culture that we're calling worldview. So whenever possible, I need to draw attention to through lines of indigenous memory that have been critical of Euro-Christian worldview. There are many different indigenous cultures on the North American continent today that still retain a through line of memory for themselves in relation to uh, an invader culture. So, although certainly obscured by colonialism, part of the task of a Native American history course must be to glean what we can of Natives' perspective from colonial sources that are always heavily biased, as I just said a few minutes ago. So that said, if we want to speak to Indigenous life, we also need to understand a minimum of about 50,000 years of presence for Indigenous peoples across both continents. Devastating as the arrival of Euro-Christian invaders has been for Native peoples, it remains a fairly recent phenomenon. In Denver, Colorado, where I live and where I'm making these lectures from, teaching the course from, we're only talking about 180 years of Euro-Christian influx of population in the area where I am living today, amid cultural memories of many different Native peoples. So, to take one example, just to like, and we'll talk about it in another lecture as well. But if we take, for example, Mummy Cave, which is up northwest of where I live here, near the entrance to Yellowstone National Park. Just as one example, when we look at a site like Mummy Cave, indigenous people, there's evidence that indigenous people lived constantly at Mummy Cave for more than 10,000 years. So right up to 1580, right? Right, 10,000 years before 1580 current era, people were occupying the site of Mummy Cave, living there, being there, having families there. There is no city there. There is the not the when we will talk about pyramids and cities and all sorts of things that exist on the two continents in this class. But here's one particular site that's just a cave where people lived for 10,000 years, well into the era of contact with Europeans. The violence of colonialism of the past 530 years is indeed significant, and we'll spend a lot of time in the class on it, but it's also a small amount of time amid what I will refer to in our class as American Indian worldview. Those of us shaped by Euro-Christian worldview tend toward linear conceptions of temporality, even history, that concept, right? Linear conception of temporality by which we provide a supposedly but not really neutral approach to time. What I mean by that is that if I've already referred to um, this by referring to 50,000 years and 10,000 years of history, it's like, oh, I'll give this little box, and here's this box of time. Here's 10,000 years up to another present, right? The metaphors that I use are linear and moving from one place up to another one. And then we could just fill in the gaps with events, right? Like because that space and that description is kind of neutral, right? That's a very Euro-Christian way of looking at things. Um, so we still count using Euro-Christian dates, even if you're not a Christian, right? It has nothing to do with whether or not you have faith as a person in the religion of Christianity, right? The dates that broadly our culture uses come from a Euro-Christian worldview, referring sometimes explicitly to capital C Christian, like before Christ, and um, uh, Deus, like in the year of our Lord, right? The AD, BC, AD system, or the more neutral Euro-Christian BCE, which is people have adopted before current era slash current era terminology to be less explicitly Christian. But we can see obviously behind it that still the ways that the dates have been traditionally divided have that shadow presence of the Euro-Christian worldview, right? So we plot dates and fill gaps with certain events. We look for contextual evidence to understand how people thought and behaved during various periods. When possible, we look to evidence of culturally discrete historical narratives for not just events, but the meaningful events that impact almost always human life, read from a deeply rooted anthropocentrism within Euro-Christian worldview, informed by earlier Hebrew and Greek androcentrism. History, as told from Euro-Christian perspectives, tends to superimpose an abstract idea of linear time onto sequences of events and talk about events that are made meaningful to humans and by humans. Euro-Christian culture is human-centered, androcentric, or anthropocentric, right? Um, it takes humanity separate from the rest of existence, separate from the rest of the relatives, as an American Indian perspective might have, right? Where humans are not separate, especially not separate in a relational, familial sense, right? But humanity or humans as a species, Homo sapiens, that is all coming from the Euro-Christian trajectory, which even in its earlier than Christian sources in Greek and Hebrew thought was already appealing to this idea of humans as separate, distinct from other creatures. So suffice it to say that so much of what we do in a history course at a university is always implicitly done from within a Euro-Christian worldview. It's not something that we can escape. It's rather something that we just need to be aware of. So I'm not saying that in pointing out the Euro-Christian worldview, like, and that's the bad way, and you have to like get out of doing that. No, we don't get out of it. It's part of our cognitive formation. So forget this kind of transcendence. Even if we're critical of the Euro-Christian worldview, which I will say, yes, we ought to do that. It doesn't mean that we get to accept ourselves from it and step outside of it, right? So in what follows in these lectures, I make no pretense to providing you with cultural competence within particular native cultures, but I will refer, as I said, to American Indian worldview, which will be deeper and cutting across some phenomena that cuts across, broadly speaking, various different American Indian cultures and languages across two continents. I will point them out, the features out as I proceed. One of the features, though, tends to be that in American Indian worldview, there is a relationship to land that is familial and intimate, and that relationship to land as a living being um, is also extended to other beings that are non-human in that region, in that space. And it could be trees, animals, insects, rocks. All of these beings have personhood within American Indian worldview. And even though I might be able to understand that intellectually, right, as a Euro-Christian person with my cognitive framing, I can understand it. And I might even be able to think, wow, that's such a, wouldn't we be so much kinder to the environment, which is a nominal abstraction, right? If I had more land intimate or interspecies intimate relationships with other entities. Yeah, I can understand that intellectually, but it is not the cognitive formation that I have from before I can even remember having memories, right? We can try to be better, but you don't get to become another worldview, right? Just imagine if you don't speak Chinese, and you decide you're going to move to um, China tomorrow, and you're only going to speak Chinese for the rest of your life. Will you eventually maybe be able to like find your way, like get somebody to give you food or shelter? You might be able to learn little bits of things, but uh, you you will never be able to completely, as an adult person, not having experienced that culture, be able to come fully within it, right? And from a worldview perspective. So we need to understand that conceptions of time and temporality differ greatly between Euro-Christian and American Indian worldview. And while I'm in no way claiming to teach my students about indigenous ways of being, I will suggest from the outset that my students at least try to think of history in terms of what circumstances needed to occur for them to arrive and abide here and now where you live. I'm assuming most of you are living in Denver and the Denver surrounding areas since the university I'm teaching this course at exists in Denver. But it's an online course this summer. Um, uh, or if you're encountering it in a different semester, these lectures. So while these are online lectures, because of where I live and where I teach, my examples at times will definitely refer to Denver, Colorado and surrounding areas. Because of the demographics where I teach, I'm going to largely frame my lectures as if I'm mostly talking to Euro-Christian people like myself, and maybe a few native students from various nations. There will also be those of you, because I teach at a Hispanic serving institution, there will be plenty of people who have mixed backgrounds, right? And as this terminology is sort of coming out, but many of you will who have those mixed backgrounds, it might have from a background from a Spanish speaking side of things, right? So Spanish culture is still Euro-Christian culture, right? And what you'll quickly start figuring out, some of you might be African Americans. It's like, well, how does this work in relationship to me if Euro-Christian replaces white people if you don't identify as white? And like, if you're starting to have those types of ideas, that's exactly why I'm using this terminology, is to get us to reflect on those categories of race, which are abstract categories that were imported and developed by Euro-Christians to separate themselves out from people who were not like them. First, Christian versus non-Christian, and then later that word Christian gets replaced with white. White people and Africans, white people and Indians, those sorts of distinctions. But the earlier form, and in a history course, we need to be more attentive to the longer duration of worldview presence. The earlier distinction is between Christian and non-Christian and what we call modern notions of race, epidermic race, skin color race, like later on now pseudo-scientific or biological conceptions of race. Those are all part of a Euro-Christian worldview and its dominant presence in the Americas here. So please understand also that DNA reports do not have any meaning with respect to American Indian worldview. Countless times, my students or people I meet on the street, I'm this percent this sort of thing. That kind of reference is always already only uh, invoking the Euro-Christian worldview claim, right? No traditional cultures used DNA analysis to decide who belongs to a nation. And I will use that term nation instead of tribe most of the time, right? These are biological categories. Are fictive categories that come from Euro-Christian worldview as well, as I've said. So we need to understand that DNA reports do not have any meaning with respect to American Indian worldview. References to blood quantum, quote, percentages or DNA are part of an inherently Euro-Christian colonial taxonomy that is devastating and ongoing today. Um, while I will often be critical of Euro-Christian expressions of Euro-Christian worldview, the goal of the class is again not simply to just make a moral claim that like Euro-Christians or quote white people are bad, right? We need to do when we do that, if that's all we're learning in this class, right? First of all, you could walk away right now, um, uh, when we do that, when people would just fall back into this kind of category of like these people, this blah, blah, bad, 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 I don't want to be part of that. It leads those folks to narcissistically focus on their own selves. So in this case, like it might like lead white folks to be like, oh me, poor me, or my white guilt, or my white shame, all of that kind of stuff. So they make it all about themselves, right? Um, uh, it leads people to narcissistically focus on themselves and then to try to justify or excuse their presence as colonial invaders. Oh, well, my family never owned slaves or blah, 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 blah. Like whatever types of like rhetoric or like we need to get away from that kind of stuff where it's always drawing people back to their own situation to try and excuse themselves from it. So uh yeah, it leads to narcissism, for people to focus only on themselves or to try to justify or excuse their presence as colonial invaders, or those who have inherited the benefits of earlier colonial invasions and the inherent capital W white supremacy of the United States government. It is more productive to my students, no matter their background, to begin by asking themselves, as I will do for those of you taking the course for credit, to ask yourself how you came to be here so that questions will those questions will ground our first discussion post-assignment and double as a way of introducing ourselves to one another. In contrast to Euro-Christian conceptions of history as linear time, we might consider indigenous emphasis on memory. Public education in the United States and the historians who have shaped it have often erased Native peoples from public memory, very intentionally so, I would argue. By contrast, and as many of my Native students may well know, Native American communities remain highly attuned to a 500-year account of Euro-Christian invasion. To outsiders, indigenous memory tends to present or be presented as a kind of genre of stories or like myth, or when written down as literature. Genres often separate from the discipline of, quote, history within the Euro-Christian Academy. There's a lot that we could glean, and we're not reading novels into this course right now when I'm teaching it, but sometimes I do teach um, uh, Native American literature, like combined with this stuff because it helps bring some of this memory content in. Um, but those genres are oftentimes separated from that Euro-Christian abstraction of history versus literature, right? Fiction versus nonfiction kind of thing. Anthropologists also, they sometimes use concepts like emic for cultural insider knowledge as opposed to edic or etic cultural outsider knowledge. But even this kind of thinking always begs the question on cultural transference of coming to know another culture. When do I become culturally competent? I want to avoid all of those discussions about cultural competence because if we're focusing on worldview, we're not talking about cultural competence. So that emphasis on coming to know another culture, perhaps in its grossest expressions as something like cultural competence or going native, right? We will definitely see incidences of Euro-Christians who think that it's a better way to live and they do go and sometimes live with native people, but they don't necessarily become native people in a worldview sense. So my Native American students will always want to compare also the content of these lectures with the knowledge of your elders in your respective communities. I am not purporting to have insider knowledge when I talk about American Indian worldview, but when I talk about the features, if it seems questionable to you, I would invite you, if you have access to elders within your community, um, to see if I'm correct about that, right? I've worked with a Native American elder to come up with some of these statements I'm making about American Indian worldview. And like all things academic, there might be a certain level of debatability, but the intention here is to bring some of that attention to American Indian worldview into the academy. So it's not surprising that in more recent public discourse in the United States, and especially on university campuses, we hear references to indigenous knowledge or science or sacred plant medicine. Uh, Let me suggest again at the outset of these lectures that a better tool for thought is a specific focus or the use of the term worldview, one that I'm pulling again from my mentor and sometimes writing collaborator, Tink Tinker, who's Washaje, Osage Nation. Washaje is the way that Osage people say it. It's just when the French came in, you can kind of see the word Osage kind of look like the Washaje. You can hear how a French person might have heard that, and it turns into the term Osage. Um, um, so I am therefore teaching what follows in this course in the form of an argument. You don't have to necessarily agree with my argument at the end of the day, but I think that you will get more and you will learn more if I am presenting the course as a kind of thesis. So my thesis here is that a worldview analysis ought to ground our inquiry into Native American history, but this necessitates an understanding of what I mean by worldview that has nothing to do with identity or ideology or perspective. So A useful offshoot of this will be perhaps confusing at first. Even if you're confused right now, don't worry. I know that it might be kind of like new, this way of framing things. And we're going to spend the course dealing with it this way, and then you can gauge whether or not you're going to agree with my thesis by the end of the course. So a useful offshoot of this will be a perhaps confusing at first claim that we ought to use the term Euro-Christian in place of the ways in the United States that people in the United States conventionally refer to, quote, white people. So I'll have a lot more to say about this term Euro-Christian throughout the course, but let me now turn a little bit more of our focused attention in lecture one here to worldview. So for Tink Tinker and I, worldview is a community-wide, society-wide consensual activity that shapes the thinking of all members of the social whole, even in their starkest individual or group differences. A worldview allows for countless variety of ideologies, including oppositional ones. Worldview signals that deep framing of reality that comes with birth and early childhood nurture into a specific communal/societal whole, much like being born into a native language community. Thus, one grows up speaking that language intuitively, and as an adult, then the world is filtered through the structures of that language. The same is true of worldview. Worldview is always intuitively infused in the person's living world. It's unconscious. And indeed, language and worldview are interconnected, even as they are not the same as one another. Importantly, worldview is not the same as ideology, which comes with a strong aspect of personal choice. One in no way chooses one's worldview, nor does one escape it, even if one comes to be aware of it or even critical of it. It is not something you can shift out of, like, I was a Democrat today and now I'm a Republican tomorrow in my political ideology. Democrats and Republicans might combat each other, have even opposing viewpoints on issues, but they both come from Euro-Christian worldview. Capitalism and communism might fight each other as broader political ideologies. They both come from Euro-Christian worldview. Worldview is not perspective. Worldview is not political choice. Worldview is not ideology or religious choice. It is a deeper cognitive framing. So another one of Tinker's students, the Anishinaabe scholar Mark Freeland, has written a book about this, and I've given some uh, 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 a PDF of an extract for some of my students as an optional reading if you're taking the course for credit. But in his recent book, it's called Ajhe Adizi. Mark Freeland helpfully distinguishes between concepts of worldview and the Euro-Christian philosophical tradition. So those, if you've taken philosophy classes and you've encountered Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's more well-known concept of Weltanschauung, that it's an important word that gets translated into continental philosophy as worldview. That is not the same thing that we're talking about, that Tinker and Freeland and I are talking about. And so if you're interested in what distinguishes that or an account of that tradition, that philosophical tradition, Mark Freeland does it in his book very, very well. So I'm not going to repeat it here, but I'm just pointing you to his really helpful book. I'm correcting um, uh, uh, my copying editing as I maneuver through my lecture here. So for our more immediate purpose, Freeland has drawn my attention to useful distinctions between indigenous and Euro-Christian approaches to temporality. So as I alluded earlier, Euro-Christian worldview tends to favor a linear conception of time and a sequence of events. Although early Greek writers such as Hesiod and Herodotus distinguished between mythological and chronological time, they tended to view their present as within a chronological time in opposition to a much more fantastical one of distant memory, like a golden age in the past, right? Similarly, as Judaic culture developed over centuries, eventually compiling and redacting various Semitic cultural expressions into the Hebrew Bible, their account of time emerged with a strong sense of genetic lineage, distinguishing a given people's specific relationship to one specific God named Yahweh, right? Senses of the elect or senses of chosenness in Hebrew culture. Euro-Christian worldview inherited a kind of synthesis of these tendencies as Rome embraced Christianity as a religion of empire over several hundred years, developing a rich sense of history employed across different European cultures. History, as a concept here, is of course more than a simple collection of facts and dates and has to do with an active meaning-making activity. It was fashionable even among pagan philosophers such as Lucretius from the first century BCE to give early accounts of the developments of civilization. You can see it in Aristotle's Politics too. Just as earlier Greek thinkers distinguished between various ages, often with an air of decline from a golden age. This kind of thinking not only influenced Euro-Christians, whose term Catholic it means universal. That's what that word Catholic means, right? Denotes a universal approach to world history. It also shaped how Euro-Christian peoples would encounter indigenous peoples previously unknown to them. Current cognitive science also tells us that our brains do not work the way that Euro-Christian philosophers of the cult of reason during the Enlightenment era or period of the 1700s and 1800s, um, how they previously thought. So there's this misconception of the capacity of reason or the cult of reason presented the idea that a kind of capital R sense of rationality was separate from emotion, separate from embodiment, and operating as a kind of executive function. That's how Enlightenment Euro-Christians came to frame things. And they wrote so much and had so much impact on the formation of the United States, the formation of France, right, as Enlightenment projects, but also on Enlightenment projects such as science, right, as they call the discipline today, right, on encyclopedias as collections of knowledge, right, on libraries, on museums, eventually anthropology. So many people today are still very much influenced by the Enlightenment tradition of among Euro-Christians, and even current Euro-Christian scientists have pointed out, even though current Euro-Christian scientists have pointed out. So we're kind of in this kind of in-between moment where cognitive science is telling us that Enlightenment rationality didn't really work, but Enlightenment rationality still frames many institutions, legal institutions, governing institutions, and so, in some ways, it's very cool because cognitive science kind of shows that it's like, oh yeah, maybe the indigenous people might be right about some things, and indigenous people are like, yeah, maybe we know some things about our cultures. Maybe we know some things about who's buried in lands without you digging up and disrupting our relatives and doing DNA analyses on them, as in the case with Kennewick Man, for example. So we know now that the mind is not separate from embodiment, nor do our brains and bodies simply reflect an outside world. Instead, current science teaches us that our neural formations establish our sense of reality. We are cognitively situated from an early age. When it comes to worldview difference, we're not saying that people cannot intellectually understand one another or that there's no communication possible. Like, I'm just a Euro-Christian, I'll never understand. Like it doesn't mean that we can't talk to each other, but it's not going to be something that where I can adopt an American Indian worldview, right? Or shift into it. Um, uh, and I can't be adopted into it, even though there is a phenomenon, yeah, of people being like adopted into various different native nations, right? But even that sense of adoption is not what we mean by a transference of worldview. So people with American Indian worldview can understand linear accounts of history. Yes, they can they can understand it, but they're not primary to cognitive orientation that they've had growing up. Um, and it depends also, right? If you're an indigenous person growing up in some of the few isolated tribes in the Amazon today, you're going to have a very heavy sense of American Indian worldview, and a less of a sense. But many, many Native peoples grow up with the domination of Euro-Christian worldview around them all the time, right? So yes, it's not that people can't understand each other. Um, so just as in the same way, people with a Euro-Christian worldview can and have long been intrigued and even excited about the ways that indigenous people live, but do not and will not ever, as a matter of conscious adoption, operate primarily from that cognitive orientation of being indigenous. Cognitive formation is neurological, unconscious, and largely develops between birth and age 5. After 5, there's some stuff we lose like trillions of brain cells that are related to our neurological formation. We still form neural pathways throughout our lives. We just don't do have nearly as much as we do between ages 0 and 5. So my worldview argument here can be especially difficult for Euro-Christian folks because they tend to highly privilege this notion of transcendence. Like, oh, I've learned this and now I'm in a better enlightened place and I can do better. Um, give them a limit and they will try to exceed it. Show them a mountain, they will try to climb it. And they'll probably take a picture of a selfie with them on top, dominating the mountain and looking out over things. And maybe they'll even use it on a dating profile, especially if they live in Colorado. Uh, um, or not Doctor, Captain Kirk, the Star Trek captain, right? Like who tells Spock in one of the Star Trek movies, why is he climbing the mountain? Because it's there, right? Give them a limit and they will try to exceed it. Show Euro-Christians new knowledge formation and they will attempt to assimilate it and master it. Show them plant medicine from the Amazon. They will claim that they, having experienced it, that they are now in the place of preaching and teaching it and of being a traditional healer. That's a phenomenon that we see constantly in current culture. The mountain climate. Prioritizing individuality, Euro-Christians will often see themselves as the sole exception to the rule. Indigenous practices for them become personal experiences stored up into a sophisticated sense of capital S self. Dissatisfied and critical of their own upbringing, they will sometimes seek new and exotic experiences of the other to intensify their experiences of transcendence. For it's in transcendence that that capital S self becomes saved, just like the dominant savior figure and the religious traditions expressive of Euro-Christian worldview. The traditional discipline of history acts as one of these knowledge pathways towards self-transcendence, traditionally speaking, anyway. So Euro-Christian accounts oftentimes employ the following: narrative accounts of a people across time, oftentimes journeying towards a goal. In cognitive science, the scientists refer to this as an idealized cognitive image schema, or ICM. A worldview has many ICMs. This particular one of like people journeying across time is sometimes called by cognitive scientists source path goal. Um, a pic so uh, there is a particular structure that Euro-Christians use of relating information to linear time. Here, events are causal and sequential. This wouldn't have happened if this wouldn't have happened, right? Like if I don't know if Einstein hadn't developed the relativity theory, blah blah blah, would Oppenheimer and those folks have been able to make the atomic bomb? Uh, a particular structure of relating information to linear time appears. Events are causal and sequential. and it's embedded in the Gregorian calendar system that may indeed contain within it past cyclical or liturgical conceptions of time that Euro-Christians often associate with the idea of the sacred, something set aside or often aligned with a sense of ecstasis or ecstasy or a lost time or a flow state, the time of ritual, right? The time, the mystical time, if you are a religious person and you're Catholic and you or Protestant and you partake in the Eucharist ceremony, you're like for Catholics, like they call it transubstantiation. You're literally eating the body and the blood of the Savior, right? On when you're taking when communion during Mass, right? That kind of thing, or the period of Lent, right, where you give something up. So there are like that happens year on a yearly cycle, on a liturgical type cycle, but amid that and overarching that is the kind of linear time that we see so much more in so-called secular culture. But even that term secular is a Euro-Christian term, right? It relates to the saeculum or the transference of the centuries over and over. Um, for Euro-Christians, ancestors are distant. They're marked by a temporal distance and oftentimes a spatial location, like where is grandma? Grandma's in heaven, type of thing, right? Heaven, hell, etc. In Euro-Christian worldview, history often becomes the narrated account enacting the meaning making of a people, the world, the universe, etc. For Euro-Christians, the process tends towards abstraction, as in analytical concepts favored by philosophical traditions, and the noun-based or nominative languages favored by Euro-Christian peoples. The good versus evil, that Manichaean kind of fight. That's so much a part of like the Euro-Christian worldview. But also like justice, um, uh, uh, God, these grand concepts. By contrast, Mark Freeland's account of indigenous worldview emphasizes memory over history. So, memory is a method of recalling information, frequently story-based, with information encoded within the narrative. It's necessary for learning and simultaneously not individualized. It's something that all people within the culture um, learn and can know and refer to for one another. It's not necessarily associated with linear or cyclical time. For American Indian worldview, ancestors are always in the present tense. They're accessible both through narrative and ceremony as epistemological energy. They share, like for American Indian worldview, we share space with the ancestors. And yes, there might be other traditions if you're an African American student and you know some things about the traditions, the indigenous traditions from Africa that persist throughout the drama of slavery, right? With ancestor relationships, right? So yeah, but I invite you to be thinking about that. I'm a Euro-Christian myself, right? I'm a white person. And so I don't claim to have that kind of knowledge. Although I've read, sure, I've read a lot of like African American literature and I know some features. So if I'm not emphasizing it in these lectures, it's just because this class is Native American history. But you will want to be thinking from your own positionalities, right? If you're Chicana or Chicano student in my class, right? You might have different ways of engaging with this question of worldview that I invite you to be thinking about actively. I can't tell you how to do that relating work in the same way that I'm asking my native students to go back to your elders and to maybe have some discussions about the ways that we're talking about some of this stuff in my class this summer. So, Tink Tinker again emphasizes that indigenous worldview prioritizes spatial relationships over temporal ones. Here again, it may be easy enough to catch a glimpse of why so many Euro-Christian folks want to see Native people as spiritual, or they want to adopt their spirituality, right? Euro Christians may even long to become indigenous, because it would signify to them a kind of self-transcendence, an escape from this world, signifying to them a sort of personal or spiritual growth. I'm critical of the ways that genocide has been brought against indigenous peoples from and by doing that criticizing work, I want to join and become in them, but like go to sweat lodges or participate in ceremonial life of Native Americans or something like that, or the various ways that this shows up in the New Age community, for sure, right? Like, oh, well, I took a psychedelic, and so I had a past life, and in my past life, I was a Native person. Those kinds of things that are always referring back to the kind of individual and the individual state of some sort of spiritual um, uh, state of being that kind of lurking quietly behind it is a state of grace or a state of being saved. Like, oh yes, but my true identity, right? So Euro-Christians may even long to become indigenous because it would signify to them a kind of self-transcendence or escape from this world, signifying to them a sort of personal or spiritual growth. But it's not happening at the level of the community, right? So it's not happening at the level of worldview. So I draw our attention at the opening of our course this semester so that my students may begin to processing how embedded we all are in worldview. The goal here again is not necessarily to escape our worldview, as if that were ever possible. Rather, the suggestion is to try to keep a sense of respectful distance with respect to indigenous peoples who have suffered greatly from the arrogance of Euro-Christian worldview being imposed globally every day. Not even so much in overtly religious forms anymore, but in economic forms and commercially expropriative expressions that emerge from that same core of influence that I'm calling Euro-Christian worldview. So, in other words, my intention here is not to single out the religion of capital C Christianity and its various forms, Protestant forms like a Presbyterian, Anglican, Lutheran, right? Baptist, Anabaptist, Seventh Day Adventists, Jehovah's Witness. It's not my intention to single out the religion of Christianity in its various forms as a faith practice today, but rather to signal a deeper metaphysics assumed by the Euro-Christian cultures at the time of contact with peoples of the continents that are now called the Americas. So we need to remember that worldview in our sense here is deeper than ideology, culture, or religion, and that Euro-Christian, that word designates that worldview that drove the impulses of European invaders as they encountered Native Americans. Yet that initial context has to be central in our mind as we approach a subject like Native American history because of the violent complexities of now over 500 centuries, sorry, excuse me, now over 5 centuries, 500 years since contact continue to shape relationships between indigenous and Euro-Christian peoples. By referring to American Indian and Euro-Christian worldviews respectively, my intention here is also not to argue for some sort of um, static and transcendent identity categories, right? So scholars sometimes refer to that tendency as essentializing. I am claiming that I am not attempting to do some sort of essentializing, although I am trying to describe worldview, something different than this romantic tendency to essentialize. So rather, my argument for worldview analysis ought to be situated in the material embeddedness of cognitive formation within a social group that transfers its worldview intergenerationally. Because it is always at the group level or the community level, one individual's consciousness does not exceed or transcend worldview, though certainly over long swaths of time, a group's worldview may change. Just like we might look at something like intergenerational trauma, especially with respect to indigenous folks, right? Yeah, that intergenerational trauma can be transferred and does show up in the cellular memory isn't always the right word for this, but epigenetic factors is that the branch of biology that's dealing with some of these factors that might relate back to intergenerational trauma, like starvation in one generation affecting the embodied makeup of the next generation, which we're seeing more and more science coming out and giving us more information on that. So let me take one more historical example to clarify my point. In the mid 1550s, one violent expression of worldview is expressed with a debate early on among Euro Christians as to whether or not Indians, and I'm using the term historically here, um, uh, whether or not Indians were fully human. So, contrasting the encounter from earlier indigenous counts from the southern continent, the recent anthropologist Eduardo Viveros de Castro notes that indigenous peoples tended to see Europeans as super beings compared to the notion of gods, in quotes here, whereas Euro-Christians, immediately when they encountered and associated, when they encountered Indians, they associated Indians with beasts and the devil, something always doubting how human they are, something that's always sees them as a possible threat. There's a kind of skepticism, there's a lack of generosity, if you want to put it that way, in the way that the Euro Christians encounter the native peoples on the southern continent at the time of contact, right? Whereas for the natives, there were a lot of different stories and among different groups, but when they tended to encounter um, the Euro Christians, they tended to see them as something fuller, something like more than human. So while natives quickly learned that Euro Christians were just regular mortals, Viveros de Castro also notes that how Euro Christians believed that with every new generation of Indians, there was this supposed backsliding. So you convert one generation, but there's something that they perceive the indigenous people as degenerating, as always sort of moving back towards the forest, and so they had to be reconverted over and over again, even if older uh, natives had already submitted to the yoke of Christianity. So always there's this image of the quote backsliding Indian giving way to the forest living, to devil worship, and to irrational superstition. Later, disenchanted with their own society, some Euro Christians came to and continue to this day, right, to exalt and romanticize native peoples as, quote, as noble savages possessing a purer form of natural religion. And that feeds right into those New Age concepts. It's really rampant in the psychedelic community today, which I did some dissertation research on. And the hype around the so-called psychedelic renaissance. So we need to be aware of these cultural tendencies from the outset of our course. They're long, they're old, they're deeply embedded. Um, they cannot all be simply unpacked in one lecture because the biases are so deeply embedded. So I will repeat myself several times throughout the course, even in this lecture. You might see I keep repeating myself. Why, for example, we might ask, do some Euro Christians, including some of my students, every semester continue to adhere to this implicitly racist assumption, for example, that indigenous peoples were savages who were just fighting amongst themselves and in dire need of Christians to come subdue them and civilize them? This is a deeply embedded bias that has occurred throughout several generations of history books that's still existent in our legal structures today. So, why do such assumptions present in papal bulls from the 1400s at the time of first contact that and then continue to be present in the foundational US laws, such as the infamous Johnson v. McIntosh case from 1823, in which Supreme Court Justice John Marshall based the whole entire legitimacy of the United States on its inheritance of the rights of discovery traced back to the Catholic or Euro-Christian papal bulls. We'll look at that specific court case later on in the semester. So such racist thinking remains pervasive in our times. Those laws continue to be cited, both in law and with unreflective and ignorant assumptions made by a nation of people who rarely learn much about the original inhabitants of these lands and their ancestors who continue to live here today with cultural memory that at times exceeds not only the formation of the United States, but very contact with Europeans. Why, for another example here, Why do Euro-Christians display collective amnesia that at the same time that their colonizers were casting Native Americans as violent savages fighting amongst themselves and in need of a Christian civilization, that Christians were killing each other in Europe? But why do they have this amnesia of the fact that Christians were killing each other in Europe between the years 1517 and 1648 in the tens of millions over religion and politics that could not be separated from religion? Why does this narrative that somehow Native Americans are savages who are just fighting amongst each other develop from these people who are killing each other in the tens of millions, like within less than a century, right? And without nuclear bombs, right? Like without like howitzers and machine guns and all of the 20th century war stuff, right? This is some brutal stuff going on in Euro-Christian culture on the European continent. Um, why, to take another example, why is it not a well-known fact that during the Black Plague in Europe, which post-19 COVID-19 research now tells us, resulted in the death rates of close to 60% of the European population. At that same time, Incan society had eradicated hunger from a population of more than 12 million people. Why do people not know that? Indeed, we will have to keep a critical eye on this very notion of civilization as it emerges from specifically Euro-Christian contexts, expressive of the desires and aspirations of deeply framed metaphysical assumptions. While we must try to work, we must at times rely on the work of anthropologists, and I will in some of my lectures here. The discipline of anthropology has also inherited this problematic notion of civilization as tied to an evolutionary and developmental view of human society, and it remains present in their discourse on cities and state formation today, just as it's present outside of just the discourse of anthropology, right? So we are told, for example, that this mysterious thing called civilization developed spontaneously in six separate regions in the ancient world: South America, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China. But we also know that some native groups had continuously occupied North American sites, such as Mummy Cave, which I mentioned earlier, from Paleolithic times right up to European contact. Are the people living for over 10,000 years continuously at Mummy Cave less civilized than the people living in the city of Cahokia over near what current day St. Louis, Missouri? Really? Hmm. It would seem by a simple deduction based on longevity that the success of the quote non-civilized societies far exceeds that of civilized ones. For a long time, Euro-Christians assumed that civilization only emerged on the Eurasian continent, and that fed their biases that they were the sole inheritors of civilization. But anthropologists have clearly shown this to be false. So, yes, we have to be careful from the start of our course with this nefarious notion of civilization, even as we rely on the work of anthropologists to construct the history of Native Americans, just as we have to look to the Euro-Christian colonizers' sources and their biases to sometimes glean some of the American Indian perspectives and the deeper American Indian worldview. Simultaneously, we're not going to escape the fact that history itself is a category emerging from the Euro-Christian worldview. We just have to have some humility and keep a check on that tendency towards transcendence and universalizing present and inherent notions of world history and human evolution. Vine Deloria's book, Red Earth, White Lies, which I'll have my students be reading from this week, is a helpful critique of Euro-Christian scientific discourse. So we'll take a look at chapter 4 from Deloria this week if you're not taking the class for credit. Red Earth, White Lies, chapter 4. The whole book is great, but only so much I can assign in a semester. So I need to wrap up this intro lecture, but first let me give one more qualifier. Of course, in one semester, it will be impossible to thoroughly account for over 50,000 years of indigenous people's presence on two continents. That said, in my next lecture, I want to disrupt some of the common assumptions that migration, human migration in space by beginning with the southern continent and a general conception of worldview. Due to limited time, students will already be reading about Euro-Christian contact this week. So if you're taking the course for credit, you're already reading stuff from when the Europeans get here. But my lectures this week are going to be covering that much broader, earlier swath of time over two continents. There's no reason in my mind to separate the northern and the southern continents, now known as the Americas, from each other when we're considering Native American history in its broadest sense, and not separating them actually helps to convey the argument that I'm making about worldview. Once we are into the colonial era, we will then focus a lot more attention on the United States. So at the outset, I just need to notice, or I should note that today, as I'm making this lecture, close to 570 native nations have nation-to-nation agreements with the invader state of the United States government, right? Um, Even within that colonial context that's ongoing, there are 570, just about, there's a little bit less, and some it's even every year maybe a new group gets recognized or something like that. With recently happened with Lumbee folks. Um, uh, but oftentimes my students can't name any if or any more than a couple of native nations. Like they might know Cherokee because they learned the Trail of Tears or something in elementary school. At the same time, so there were at least as of 2010 census, there were 334 federal and state recognized reservations, amounting to about 100 million acres. Native Americans make up close to 2% of the US population, and their population has been growing. There were 370 treaties with tribal nations between 1778 and 1871, establishing nation-to-nation agreements, including recognition of tribal sovereignty as inherent to their presence. That's just in the United States, right? That's not including Canada or Mexico or Central and South America. So I'm going to stop the intro lecture here. I'm going to pick up this discussion again in my next lecture. Students taking a class for credit should read Vine Deloria and any other reading assignments in the syllabus this week. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Native American History, and I hope you have a productive semester. I'm gonna exit out of here. Take care.